Good evening. I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here. I'm a dry bean breeder at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada here at Lethbridge. And bean breeding is a team effort, and I would like to acknowledge the people listed on the slide. Kathy Daniels, Todd Reed, and Stephanie Kinney are full-time research staff with the dry bean breeding program. Katie Quinn and Paige Postman are summer students with the program. Gerald Karolek is the research technician who does the canning, the cooking and canning quality evaluations. And I'll talk about the cooking and canning quality very briefly as I go through the presentation. And Dr. Syama Chatterton, whom you'll hear from today, is the special crops pathologist at AFC Lethbridge, and we work with Dr. Chatterton for disease resistance breeding. And again, I'll talk very briefly about disease resistance breeding in dry bean as I go through the presentation. The Food and Agriculture Organization has declared 2016 as the International Year of the Pulses, and you can go to this website to get more information. And this is to promote the awareness of pulse crops to people around the world. In some countries, pulses are consumed on a daily basis, whereas in the other countries, pulses are consumed on an occasional basis. And this is the logo that they came up with for the International Year of the Pulses. And here they have tried to represent as many pulses as possible. Here's the dark red kidney bean, the white kidney bean, the black bean. This is probably a green pea, a yellow pea, a lentil, and there's also a garbanzo bean, which is a chickpea or the garbanzo bean, and so on. And if you look carefully, it's shaped in the form of a heart, and that's to convey the message that consumption of pulses is good for human health. Pulses have low fat content compared to cereals. They also have high protein content compared to cereals. I prepared this presentation 2 weeks ago, but when I came here, there's a very nice brochure on the first table there, prepared by the Food and Agriculture Organization, that highlights some of what I just mentioned. Pulses are also good for the environment as well, and that is because in symbiotic association with the bacteria, they're able to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. For example, pea and the field pea and faba bean, for example, both of the pulse crops that are grown in Alberta, they're able to meet half their nitrogen requirement or more than half of their nitrogen requirement by fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. They're able to take the nitrogen and they're able to fix it in their root system, and they'll be able to use it as well. And they also leave behind some nitrogen for the subsequent crop, whether it is wheat, canola, or barley, or potato or sugar beet for that matter, which are grown in Southern Alberta. So they leave behind residual nitrogen for the subsequent crop as well. As a result, we only need to apply less nitrogen to the pulse crop and also to the succeeding, the crop that follows the pulse crop. As a result of applying less nitrogen, so there's less nitrogen loss in the environment to leaching and also to volatilization and so on. So it's good for the environment because they save the nitrogen, and it also reduces input cost for the growers as well. These are the pulse crops that are commonly grown in Canada. With the exception of mung bean, all of the other pulse crops are grown in Alberta. There's currently research underway at the Crop Diversification Center in Brooks, Alberta, in terms of identifying mung bean lines that could be grown here. They just need a little bit more heat units than what we currently have, so they're trying to find lines that we could grow in Alberta. The pea, lentil, dry bean, chickpea, and faba bean are considered as pulses because the dry seed or the dry product of these crops are consumed. Green pea and green bean that we usually get in the supermarket, they're part of the legume family, but they're not considered pulses. The soybean and peanuts, they're also part of the legume family, but we call them leguminous oil seeds because they're high in oil content. They are high in protein as well, but they're high in oil content, so they're considered as leguminous oil seeds. So the pulses are usually the pea, lentil, dry bean, chickpea, faba bean, and mung bean. There are various pulse grower organizations spread across Canada: the Ontario Bean Growers, Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and also the Alberta Pulse Growers Commission that are involved in promoting pulse production, pulse research, pulse market access for Canadian pulse crops, and so on. And you can visit any of their websites again to get more information on the pulse crop and how you could include pulses in your diet. They have a lot of recipes listed on their website that'll enable you to include various pulse crops in your diet. And all of these organizations, they come under a broader umbrella of Pulse Canada. Another website to get good information is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. They have basic information in terms of the importance of pulse crops to the Canadian economy. And the data on the website is current as of 2014 because it does take a year or two to include up-to-date information. So they're still probably processing the 2015 data right now. So the data is current up to 2014. So in 2014, on the prairies, the pulse crops for these three prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, the export value of the pulse crop for these three prairie provinces was approximately $2 billion, next only to canola and wheat. And much of the pulse crops that were grown in Canada were exported to Asia and Middle East. The pulses were also exported to the other countries as well, but mostly primarily to Asia and the Middle East. I'm a bean breeder, so I'm going to focus from this point forward, I'm going to focus the presentation on dry bean. In Canada, we grow dry bean on approximately 300,000 acres, and more than 75% of what is produced is exported to other countries. So Canada is the fourth largest exporter of dry bean in the world. And 25% of the Canadian production comes from Alberta, and all of the dry beans in Alberta are grown under irrigation, which is primarily in Southern Alberta, south of Trans-Canada. Of course, there are some irrigated acres north of Trans-Canada Highway as well, but majority of the acres is south of the Trans-Canada Highway towards the Saskatchewan border, from Coaldale to Saskatchewan border. So they're all irrigated acres. And what is locally produced is also locally processed as well. There are two bean processing plants by Viterra, just in the outskirts of Tabor and in Bow Island. So all of the beans that are locally grown are also processed locally as well before they're exported to other countries. So again, that creates employment and also returns to local communities such as Tabor and Bow Island, and also other communities in between. Dry bean has different market classes. These are the 5 market classes that are grown in Alberta, and I'll show you images of the seeds of these market classes as I go through the presentation. Pinto bean, Great Northern bean, black, red, and yellow. In addition, there are other market classes that are grown in Canada. That's navy bean. This is the bean that you get in pork and beans in tomato sauce in the supermarket, and also it's canned with molasses and so on. Then there's cranberry bean. I'll show you an image of cranberry bean later. Then there are kidney beans, which is dark red kidney, which is usually you get it in a beef bean chili, for example. Then there's light red kidney and also white kidney bean. Then there are 2 other market classes, Otibo and Kintoki, which is primarily for the Japanese market and is grown only in Ontario. And all of these bean types, the primary end use is for food. Less than 2% of the bean that is produced ends up in feed. It's usually the broken beans and the split beans that ends up as feed. So 98% of bean that's produced is food. So the seed quality of dry bean is extremely important. And we'll talk about the seed quality traits as I go through the presentation. Bean breeding is a long-term. It takes 10 to 12 years to develop bean cultivars and make them commercially available, or make them available for commercial production using winter nurseries, like sending seeds to Chile or another country in the southern hemisphere, or using other techniques in plant breeding. We can reduce the number of years by maybe 3 to 5 years, but it's still a long-term effort. And it starts with crossing 2 bean cultivars or 2 bean lines, and then the progenies are evaluated year after year after year in the field. They're grown in the greenhouse, and then eventually they're evaluated year after year in the field. The traits that we look for, or the characteristics that we look for. This is a picture of our bean breeding nursery in Lethbridge, and this picture was taken by Dr. Henning Mandel. He's right here, and he was the bean breeder at AFC Lethbridge until 2003, and when he 2007, and 2003 is when I joined AFC. Yeah. Sorry, thank you. 2007, and when he retired, I took over the bean breeding program from Dr. Henning Mandel. So Henning is here. He took this picture in 2003. Here it's a Fairfield Research Farm. So this is just an image of our dry bean breeding nursery. The objectives. Excuse me. The objectives of the breeding program are to develop cultivars with both high yield and early maturity. And that's because Saskatchewan and Alberta has one of the shortest growing season in Canada. So we want to have both. We want the bean cultivars to mature prior to the fall frost, and at the same time have high yield as well. And we want the beans to have lodging resistance, like beans to be upright both at the time of flowering and at the time of maturity, because it helps with the harvesting of beans, and also it reduces white mold. So one of the major disease that we have here is white mold, and another disease is common bacterial blight, and I have a slide to discuss these two diseases later. And as I mentioned earlier, because food is the major end use of bean, seed quality is important. Large seed size, improved color retention, and cooking and canning quality are all some of the important traits. And I'll provide an example of the improvements that we have made for some of these traits, or for most of these traits, as I go through the presentation. This is a commercial yellow bean field, and it was taken in 2015, in August 7th of 2015. The commercial cultivar that is currently grown is Mayasi yellow bean, and this is a AAC Y015, is a yellow bean line from our program that we just registered last year. And the yellowing that you see here, or the senescing that you see here, is because of early maturity. This line, Y015, matures 5 to 10 days early compared to Mayasi. And in some years, that 5 to 10 days will decide whether a grower has a good food grade bean, or is it a poor quality bean, which most probably will end in a dumpster, because it wouldn't even end up for feed use. So early maturity is extremely important. We know from years and years of testing that this line is also higher yielding than Mayasi, and I'll show you in a later slide that Y015 also has a much nicer color compared to Mayasi as well. And this slide has excuse me, images of bean plants with common bacterial blight and also white mold. Because the beans are grown under irrigation, white mold is a major problem that we have here. Anytime bean is grown under high moisture environment, white mold is there. We work closely with Dr. Syama Chatterton in order to include resistance to these two diseases. And disease resistance breeding is the best way to address this issue, because disease-resistant cultivar most often will reduce the number of time you have to spray, or you don't have to spray fungicides or bactericides or any chemicals at all. So it reduces input cost to the bean growers, and most importantly, it also reduces the chemical that goes into the environment as well. So this is one of the disease resistance breeding is one of the best way to address this. Almost all of the cultivars that we have released from our program since 2004, I believe, when AC Resolute was released, have some levels of resistance to white mold. And in 2014, we were able to release a first bean line with resistance to bacterial blight. And I'll show you an image of that line as I go through the presentation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these are the various seed quality traits that we look for. Seed size, shape, color retention, and color pattern are all important. Color pattern is important when there is more than one color, and as you will see in the next slide. These two cultivars, Y012 and Y015, were registered just last month for commercial production, and both are actually in commercial production this year in Southern Alberta. And as you can see from the slide, these two lines have much nicer seed coat color, brighter yellow color compared to Mayasi or CDC salt. And brighter color means also premium for the bean growers, anywhere 2 to 5 cents a pound premium for the bean growers here, depending on the market. This is a pinto bean market class. This is how pinto bean looks like. This is AC Island. It was registered in 2007. Again, Dr. Henning Mandel co-developed this line along with various colleagues in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada.
This one.
So,
Including this one.
Thank you. So he's one of the co-developer of this line. Again, there's nothing wrong with AC Island, but if you look at these three lines, they have a brighter color, seed coat color compared to AC Island. We registered AAC Explorer. Again, Henning is also a co-developer of this line, AAC Explorer, that we registered last month. It has a much brighter pinto bean color compared to AC Island. Again, as I said, there's nothing wrong with AC Island, but the consumers want a brighter color, and so we were able to register this line. These two lines are experimental lines in our program. We have at least 2 more years before we decide whether to register these two lines. And this is a pinto bean market class. And as I mentioned, the beans are either cooked and consumed or they're canned and then consumed. So cooking and canning quality are extremely important. Gerald Kerlick is the research technician at AFC Lethbridge who does this. Hard seed is an issue that we have in dry bean, not just in this navy bean market class, but almost in all bean market classes. We have this hard seed. If you look carefully, this seed here and this seed did not absorb any water at all, even after an overnight soak. Whereas these seeds have partially absorbed water, whereas these seeds here have completely absorbed water. We expect the beans to double in weight after an overnight soak, after a 16-hour soak, for example. So we see these hard seeds, and we certainly don't want to release a bean line where a vast majority of the seeds do not soak up any moisture at all. So that's one of the issues we have. So we evaluate all experimental bean lines. Starting in 2011, all experimental bean lines from Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are evaluated for cooking and canning quality here in Lethbridge. And in Ontario, cooking and canning quality data is required before they would even allow a bean cultivar to be registered in Canada. So that's how important the cooking and canning quality are. This is an image of a bean retort that we used to use until last year, and this is the sealer that we used to seam the cans. And in March of this year, we were able to replace this old retort with a state-of-the-art retort. In fact, for the whole day today, I was in the bean lab because there was a training on how to use this retort. So we can all of these beans, and then after 2 weeks, we open these cans. We look at the clumping or the matting of the bean seeds in the can. Then we also look at the appearance of the bean seeds as well. And then we assess seed coat color using this chromometer. We assess the color before canning and also after canning, both in dry seed and processed seed. And then we assess the texture of the canned beans. This simulates the mouthfeel. We put 100 grams of canned beans here, and then this cell here, it drives through here, so it shears the beans, it simulates the mouthfeel. So we evaluate the mushiness of the beans. Again, we certainly don't want to release a bean that turns mushy after processing. And all of these data is then provided to the bean breeders across the country, who then use those data to make decisions on which lines to move forward for registration. But lastly, the last topic I want to talk about is the new market classes. Cranberry bean and navy bean are grown in Manitoba and Ontario. Currently, cranberry bean and navy bean are not grown in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So as part of diversifying the bean market classes in Alberta, we started working on cranberry bean, I believe in 2005. Red Rider is from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Centre in Harrow, Ontario. So after several years of testing, so these are the lines that we have come up with. These two lines we are currently evaluating these lines for yield, maturity, for their lodging resistance, for their cooking and canning quality, and also for their white mold resistance as well. So we still have at least 1 or 2 years before we decide whether to register these beans for commercial production in Alberta. And the next market class is again navy bean. These two lines are from Ontario and Manitoba, whereas these lines are from our program. When we evaluated these lines in the field, we saw 4,000 pounds per acre yield, and that's really high for beans. So that's why we didn't want to throw any of these lines out. They're not commercially grown yet, but we wanted to see if we could grow any of these lines commercially in Alberta. So again, these lines are going through the evaluation process as well. They'll be under evaluation for at least 2 years before we make any decisions on these lines, whether to register these lines or not. And again, so the cranberry bean and the navy bean market classes are part of diversifying the bean market classes that are available for the bean growers. This is a bean planting in 2016. We use a highly specialized seeder. I believe this is a P trial for Dr. Syama Chatterton. We were planting this, the dry bean crew. This is Todd and this is Kathy. They were planting this bean trial for Dr. Chatterton. And this slide basically lists all the bean cultivars from our program and that are commercially grown. There were several cultivars that were released from our program, but for various reasons, they are not commercially grown right now. They've been deregistered. I would like to draw your attention to these two yellow beans here that was registered in 2016. AAC White Star was also registered last month. It's a Great Northern bean. I'll show you an image of this one in the next slide. AAC Explorer, again, it's a pinto bean, and you saw that in one of the earlier slides. 2 years prior to that, we registered AAC Burdette, AAC Whitehorse, and AAC Black Diamond 2. Black Diamond 2 is the first black bean cultivar for Alberta with resistance to common bacterial blight. And again, with the exception of these yellow bean, for all of the bean lines listed here, they were all developed by Dr. Henning Mandel and his colleagues at the research center. And again, this is AAC White Star. It's a Great Northern bean. It has a large white seed, and this is AAC Black Diamond 2 with the bacterial blight resistance. And you saw these two in the previous slides. And bean breeding it's a lot of efforts, it's a lot of work. We get a lot of help from staff at Lethbridge and also from collaborators across the country. So I want to thank all of them for their hard work. And bean breeding is also possible because of generous contributions that we receive from the various organizations, because without the financial support, we wouldn't even exist. So I would like to thank Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Alberta Crop Industry Development Fund, Alberta Innovates Biosolutions, Alberta Pulse Growers Commission, and Viterra for their financial support. So with that, I'll stop my presentation, and I'll invite Syama.
You didn't tell us your name?
Parthiba. It was in the first slide, sorry.
People might not know how to pronounce it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll go to the first slide. It's easier that way, sorry. First name is Parthiba. Last name is Balasubramanian. It's actually 3 names kind of joined together. So Balasubramanian.
What's your nickname?
Parthiba. Go by first name. So. Shama, please. Oh yes.
What bean type and do you see growing the most?
Oh, the pinto is the largest market class. Close to 50% of the bean acres, around 50,000 acres in Alberta. So 50% of the bean acres are pinto market class. That's the brown seed that you saw. Yeah, and followed by Great Northern. That's the one with the white seed coat color. And then the yellows, red, and black almost equal. So around 5,000 to 6,000 acres each.
And 20 years from now, what will you see for acres and varieties?
So it depends on where the market is. The market is primarily Mexico, the Central and South American countries, and the majority of the beans that are consumed there are pinto, black, and red. And it's in the Pacific coastal areas of Mexico that they consume yellow beans. The yellow beans was first grown in Alberta in 2009. Before that, there was no commercial field of yellow bean, and that's because all of a sudden there was an interest in yellow bean. The yellow beans is a niche market class. It's usually sold at a higher price. So when the Viterra here realized that we could grow yellow bean, then they jumped into it. So there's always that factor as well. But the large market for beans is the pinto bean, followed by black bean. And the reds go to Colombia, and I know there's a problem with the free trade agreement and all that. So there was a time when the US had a free trade agreement with Colombia, but not Canada. So there was a year that we couldn't export any Canadian red beans to Colombia, and then a year later, the Canadian government signed off on the free trade agreement. So all of a sudden, everything was okay. So all of those external factors affects us well. But because of the NAFTA agreement with Mexico, so we know it's a stable market. So it's primarily the pinto bean. And the black bean. And all the Great Northerns go to the Mediterranean region, to Greece, Italy, and so on. And the cranberry bean that I showed, I was on a market mission to Italy in 2007 as part of Pulse Canada mission to Italy. And that's where we realized there was a big cranberry bean market in Italy that we could ship our seeds to. So that's what got my interest into cranberry bean. But we don't know what will happen yet because it hasn't been commercially grown in Alberta yet. So, yes, Henny.
About 12, 15 years ago, few growers were growing on contract with for Viterra, whatever it was called then.
Yes.
The cranberry beans, and they had every field had really lots of problems with the seed coat damage on harvesting.
Yes. Yeah, in 2006, we were in a field, cranberry bean field in Southern Alberta. It was a line from Idaho, from Gentech in Idaho, and Cran 09, and it grew well, but when at the time of processing, the seed split open. So the seed coat integrity is very important, as I mentioned, because for food use, you want the seed to stay intact, whether you're cooking it or you're canning it, it doesn't matter. So the seed coat integrity is important, but these lines, they were crossed and they were selected under Alberta condition in the semi-arid environment. So that's why we're hoping that it does well. And it's been grown in Viterra field demonstration trials as well in the growers field for 1 year already. And so far we haven't heard any complaints yet. So, but that's why I said we have to evaluate the lines at least for 2 more years before we make any decisions on the cranberry line. But you're right, Henning. Yes, they were grown 1 year, but the line was bred elsewhere. So, oh yes,
I don't know if Dr. Sharma is going to touch on this, but certainly from all your literature, it shows the nutritional value of eating beans. And we just heard recently that the greatest factor in achieving longevity is how much fiber you eat. And of course, the beans have so much fiber. So this seems to be the, just the #1 food for keeping yourself healthy.
I think pulses in general have a higher fiber content. There's a pamphlet there, the blue one there from Alberta Health Services is just all about fiber. So thank you for raising that. Yes.
Which bean do you suggest? Which one is healthier? More nutrition, more fiber, lower GI?
To be honest, I don't know if I can answer that question. I like all of the beans, to be honest. Each of the beans have specific end use as well. Like the black bean that I showed is primarily used in the soup It's usually in the soup because it has a thicker seed coat. That's one of the, it has a higher texture. So that's why it's used in the soup. The pinto bean, for example, the one with the brown seed coat color, for example, is used, it's cooked and it's then mashed. It's used in burritos, for example, mixed with cheese and used in burritos. So each bean has a unique end use. So it depends on preference, I would think. And a lot of people have told me the large-seeded beans, the kidneys and the yellow beans, they find it too pasty because because of the large seed size, there's way more starch in there and all that relative to the seed coat. The smaller beans, the navy, the black beans, the pinto beans tend to be more crunchy. So it depends on your taste as well.
Hey, thanks. That was very interesting, Parthiba. So my name is Syama Chatterton, and I am the pulse pathologist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So I'm just going to start with talking about why grow pulses. Parthiba already covered this extensively, so I'll just do a kind of a quick summary. And I think the #1 reason to grow pulses is because they're delicious and nutritious. And I can even sneak them into some food for my son back there, and he doesn't know all the time. And as Parthiba had said, they're a very high value crop with an excellent export market. And from a disease perspective, I say grow pulses because they add diversity to crop rotations. So mostly what we see grown in the prairies is cereals and canola, and you can get cereals and canola and cereals and canola. And what happens is you start getting disease buildup, particular to those crops. So if we add some peas into that mix, here you start breaking that disease cycle of your cereal and canola crops. So pulses really help add diversity to the agricultural program. And most importantly, as Parthiba said, they provide nitrogen benefits to the soil. So here's a picture of a pea root, and you can see all these little pink nodules here. Those are just filled with bacteria. Those fix atmospheric nitrogen, turn it into nitrogen that the plant can use. The plant gives it sugars, and because of that, you don't need to add fertilizer to your pulse crops, as Parthiba had mentioned. So in my pulse program, we primarily study dry beans, field peas, lentils, and faba beans. And I've just shown you how great pulses are, and unfortunately every crop that you grow is going to get sick. So much like humans, plants get sick too. They can get sick by the same things that cause diseases in humans: viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And for plants, the #1 organism that causes disease is fungi. So unlike humans, it's usually more viral bacterial diseases. Fungi seem to love feeding on plants. And you can get all these different symptoms. Usually that what the end result is that you're going to have a big impact on yield. So we start to see yield losses, and that can threaten crop production. Okay, so plant diseases are a threat to global food security, and I just kind of did a quick Google search to be like, what are the hot topics in disease right now? And apparently there's a banana crisis in Latin America that is maybe going to start threatening some of our banana production, or maybe prices will go up in the grocery store. This has made big news with olive trees in Italy that are being ravaged by a bacterial disease. So olive oil prices are going up in the store. This isn't a food crop, but very important in sort of natural environment in England, where a lot of the ash trees are dying because of a new disease there. And maybe the saddest one is chocolate. This one has also made a lot of news, where there's sort of new fungal infections that are coming into a lot of these cocoa plantations and starting to threaten chocolate production. So that's sort of the big picture, where you can see globally plant diseases can have a big impact on our food supply. And then if we look closer to home and start looking at some of the agricultural journals, we can see that there's issues with diseases on wheat crops. And that's probably a whole other presentation, because there's a lot of interesting research going on in Lethbridge on wheat diseases. And then we see that pulse diseases are sort of making hits in these agricultural journals as well, or agricultural magazines, just with the impact that they're starting to have on production. So I'm going to start by just giving a quick sort of plant pathology 101 lesson. So a lot of people don't have to take plant pathology anymore in universities. So I'll just kind of talk about what some of the main principles are, so that as I start talking about some of the research that we do, we can put it into context with what some of these sort of guiding principles are in plant pathology. So really, plant pathology is the study of plant diseases in order to minimize disease impact and enhance sustainable production. And what I mean, sustainable production is kind of a buzzword everywhere. Everyone wants to buy sustainable. So what I mean by sustainable here is being able to minimize your inputs, so things like pesticides, irrigation, things like that, while maximizing yield. So that's what I mean by sustainable production. And then just to remember that disease generally is the exception, not the rule. So it's much like humans. Most of us, for the most part, walk around healthy, and there's a small percentage of the population that has disease. So we see that same thing in plants. You know, when you're driving down the road, unless you're like me and a plant pathologist and pick out disease on every crop that you're driving by, for the most part, the plants are generally healthy. But it's that exception, it's when we're starting to look at the exception, that's when we have to start doing the research. So the three major guiding principles of plant pathology are the plant disease triangle, the disease cycle, and how those two fit together to look at integrated disease management. So the plant disease triangle is just a very simple concept that you need to have three things in order for disease to occur. You need to have a pathogen, you need to have the host, and you need to have the environment. And all those three things need to come together at the same time in order for disease to develop. So in this scenario here, we have all three things present that are needed for disease, so you get full onset of disease. And as you start to maybe different components are absent or can be manipulated, you'll start to change that triangle. Where here, if there's something, maybe it's a better host, so you're shifting that triangle away from, you're shifting the advantage away from the pathogen and towards the host. Over here, maybe you don't have the right pathogen component, so you're shifting the advantage away from the pathogen again. So you need to have all these three things, pathogen, host, and environment, in order for disease. So that's really the first principle of plant pathology. And then the other is the disease cycle, and that's that we need to understand what's happening with the pathogen, how it completes its life cycle, so we can start to figure out what are some opportunities to maybe disrupt that disease cycle or have an impact on the pathogen. So we always start with number one, which is usually fungal spread, or what we would call initial inoculum. So what's present in the environment at any given time that can then start a disease progression. If you have that inoculum present, it usually responds to the presence of a host and will start to germinate and move towards that susceptible host. And then you go through the infection phase here, where you start to see different symptoms showing up on the plant. As those grow on the plant, the fungal will start to grow and reproduce, and then it can go on a cycle here where you get more and more disease being produced as the fungus is growing. And then maybe you're getting towards the end of the growing cycle, the plant is starting to naturally die off and senesce, and then you have the fungal, it goes into dormancy or produces more inoculum that will then go into dormancy over the winter, and usually will then come back to life in the spring once a new susceptible host is planted. Okay, so when we look at integrated disease management, it's really putting together those two concepts of the disease triangle and the disease cycle and saying where can we have the greatest impact on that disease. And really, as Parthiba had mentioned, the number one way to do that is through resistance, and that's really the job of breeders to try and develop plant cultivars that have disease resistance. And that's really our best management option that we have. After that, we look at avoidance. So that's selecting a site where you know you're not going to have a lot of disease present in the soil. And we primarily do that through crop rotation. And that's what I showed you at the beginning, where you want to make sure that you have a diverse crop basis so that you're breaking that disease cycle. After that, we look at protection or therapy, and that's to reduce the rate of infection. And that's usually by using fungicide, bactericide, or some other barrier to prevent that infection. The next principle is looking at exclusion. So try to prevent pathogens from moving into your crop. This works better, say, in a greenhouse environment where you can clean out your crop after every growing cycle and start fresh. And so you're excluding any new pathogens from entering. And then finally, we have eradication, and that's trying to destroy or inactivate the inoculum. So if you see that there's a few plants that are infected in the field, you might be able to go out and pull them before they start spreading to other crops. And this is particularly important when you're trying to prevent the spread of a new disease coming into an area. So you can, if you see a new pathogen pop up, you try and eradicate any plants that you see that are there. So that's kind of the context that we're working with here for integrated disease management. And now I'll talk about how that fits in with pulse plant pathology. Okay, so we get a lot of diseases of pulse crops in Southern Alberta. And if I talked about all of these, we'd probably be here for another 3 to 4 hours. So I had to choose a few to focus on. But what we're looking at here is, so we have white mold of dry bean, which Parthiba had talked about. This is one that's popped up very sporadically in Southern Alberta. This is rust on dry bean. This is root rot of peas. The other big disease on peas here is something called Mycosphaerella blight. I don't give them names. They're named by someone else, and sometimes I like to give them really complicated names. But this one is my son's favorite. This one is called chocolate spot faba bean. So he did a little project on that for his grade 5 science fair. Then we have anthracnose of lentil down here, bacterial wilt of bean, and this is blossom blight of alfalfa. So a lot of different variety of diseases that we can see down here in Southern Alberta. Keeps me very busy, and there's really no end to the research that can be done. But I'm going to focus today on some of the research that we do on white mold and then on root rot of peas. So as Parthiba had mentioned, all beans are grown under irrigation in Southern Alberta. And you can just see from this picture, as you know, you're getting this nice water applied to this nice dense crop. You're creating really nice environment for this white mold pathogen to be able to flourish. And it's caused by, long Latin name is Sclerotinia sclerotiorum. And really what this pathogen does is it leaves behind these little sclerotia in the soil. So they look like little kind of stones or rocks that are left behind in the soil. They can survive in the soil for a number of years. And when a susceptible host crop appears, or when the environment is good, the sclerotia germinate to produce these tiny little mushroom-like structures. The term is apothecia, but that's a very scientific term. So just kind of think of them as little golf tees or little mushroom structures. And these puff off to produce millions of spores that are then released into their crop canopy and can cause disease. And as Parthiba had showed before, again, here's some of the symptoms that we see. So the spores will kind of land on flowers. The flowers fall down, they get caught in sort of the branches, and then you can start to see the white mold that just kind of takes over the plant here. And then at advanced stages, you can see a lot of disease and a lot of the impact here where you basically knocked out your dry bean plant. Okay, so the environment that's required for this pathogen is very cool and humid periods during flowering. So this is usually towards the end of July and August. The issue with this pathogen is it's very sporadic when you get that sort of environment, but when you get that environment, it can wipe out a crop very quickly. So this is a picture that I think Parthiba took in 2010. This was before I was here. I think that was the last bad white mold year, so I moved here and white mold was cured, right? I'm sure it's coming again. And really what happens is that you get this really dense viney canopy that reduces air movement, and you get sort of an increased humidity down at the soil surface, decreased temperature, and that's the ideal condition for those little mushrooms and spores to be produced. So in terms of disease management, some of the tools that we're working with, Parthiba is working at resistance. As he said, we've seen a lot of improvement in resistance to white mold, but when you look at the genetics of dry beans, they really don't have a good host resistance. So we're kind of starting off on sort of a shaky footing anyway, trying to move some resistance into these dry bean crops. Avoidance is a really good management tool, and this is why most bean growers practice really good crop rotations. They'll only grow beans about every 4 years to try and reduce that exposure to the sclerotia. And then a lot of protection or therapy is used, and fungicides are often sprayed during that susceptible period or during flowering. And then when we look at exclusion, again, sort of crop rotation is part of that principle. Site selection, making sure that maybe you're not going right next to a neighboring bean field that you can have a lot of spores move into your field. And then one of the questions that we have with research is, can we use irrigation timing as sort of a mechanism of exclusion? So what we're looking at for research is combining when they apply irrigation. So maybe if you hold off applying it during the flowering period, which is the most susceptible time, with cultivar selection, will that help improve the environment to exclude the pathogen? So we're trying to create an unfavorable environment for the pathogen during that susceptible period. And this is work that's being done by postdoc Kazi. He's sitting there in the back row. And basically what we do is we have field trials with a whole bunch of different types of cultivars. You can't actually, I thought you'd be able to pick out the different Parthiba can probably tell me from looking at the slide what the different cultivars are, but I don't have that breeder's eye. But so we're comparing cultivars that kind of have a viney, prostrate growth habit with cultivars that have a very upright growth habit. And then we measure all these different environmental factors. So here's a leaf wetness sensor in the middle of the canopy to look at how those cultivars are changing that environment. And then we look at how that affects white mold development. So I won't go into, it's still a work in progress, so we don't have a lot of results yet, but I just wanted to give you an overview of that research that we're doing. And now I'll switch over to talk about my favorite topic, which is root rot of peas. So I'll just start with a little overview of pea production in Alberta and then get into sort of the nitty-gritty of the disease. And so when we look at pea production in Alberta, we can see that this is a crop that is grown all throughout Alberta. We have a lot of production here, so this sort of light green area is all the pea production. About 50% of production in Alberta occurs south of Highway 1, so all down in our area. But you can see that it stretches all the way up north of Edmonton, and then there's a lot of production in Peace River as well. So overall, this is a record year for pea production in Alberta. I think we're sitting at over 1 million acres of peas this year. So I think we're catching up to winter wheat anyway. Maybe not quite to the other cereals yet. Okay, so what we found, though, in the past few years is that we're starting to get what we've called the late season root rots. And what you see in these fields is you start to see these yellowing patches popping up usually about now, kind of when they're just starting to get into flowering. You'll see them start to pop up, and then they kind of spread throughout the whole field. And usually it starts with waterlogged areas, and then every time you grow peas again, that patch spreads more and more. Okay, so in order to understand this disease triangle, we first needed to know what pathogen are we working with, and that turned out that was really not a very easy answer. Because unlike most diseases where it's kind of one pathogen, one disease, this one we found that it's actually caused by a pathogen complex. And the two most important species in this complex are Fusarium. Again, we have the Latin names, can't get away from them. But Fusarium, which causes this very unique sort of reddening in the middle of the plant. This is sort of the plant vein. It's called the vascular system. And then we have a new one for Alberta. It's called Aphanomyces, and this causes kind of overall browning and decay of the root system. Okay, so just a little more information on the environment that both of these pathogens like. So Aphanomyces likes wet, warm soils in order to infect, and it produces really long-lived resting spores in soil that can survive more than 6 years. So it kind of triggers already that there may be some issues with crop rotation when we're thinking about putting in peas every 4 years, and here you have a pathogen that can maybe survive for longer than 6 years. It can only infect peas and lentils, and it can infect a few alfalfa varieties. So again, that's going to have implications for what crop rotation strategies you can use. And then the other pathogen that we're looking at is the Fusarium species. These like moderately dry and warm soils, so maybe we see it more prevalent down here in Southern Alberta where we have drier soils. And this one doesn't produce resting spores, but it can survive on crop residue that's left in the field. So that's how it bridges from crop to crop until peas are in the soil again. And it has a very wide host range. It can infect cereals and canola, but it does pretty minor damage. It seems to really like pulse crops. So it just kind of sits there growing a little bit every year, and then once you throw in a pea crop, it really loves it. Okay, so when we look at the root rot symptoms, Fusarium often starts at the point of seed attachment, which would be right here. You start to see these little lesions. It starts to spread along the taproot, and then you get spread all the way down to the taproot, and you start getting a little bit of necrosis on those lateral roots. And then eventually you can get roots that kind of look like this, where there's not much left to them. And then, like I showed before, oftentimes if you cut that open, you can see this really nice kind of red streaking in the plant. And we compare that to Aphanomyces. This creates, like I said, kind of an overall browning of the root. So you can see you get this pinching off that all the way up to the root system, and then it usually stops pretty abruptly at the soil level. At advanced stages, you can see there's really not much left to the root. So when you pull the plant out of the ground, you're kind of left with these little nubs. And then if you look at them under the microscope, you can see all these little oospores. Well, these are the resting spores that are left behind in the soil that can survive for a fairly long time. And here's just a close-up of this cell. So you can see it's got a very thick cell wall, which is what helps it survive in the soil for a number of years. Okay, this is what the disease looks like in the field. So what happens is you get a lot of dying off of pea plants, and you can see that they're not filling up the space like you would expect them to. And then you can see a lot of kind of yellowing down at the bottom of the soil. Okay, and then if you dig up the roots, before I showed you some really nice symptoms, like here's Fusarium, here's Aphanomyces, we dig up the roots and we're like, oh, okay, I don't know what I have on my roots. So we can get really nice distinct symptoms in the lab, and then you get out into the field and it starts getting really tricky at what you're looking at. So most often we're finding that it's both Fusarium and Aphanomyces, and then there's usually a few extra fungi that are thrown in there too, just to make things even more complicated. Okay, so when we talk about environments that are really driving these root rots, they like wet, warm soils. So I've downloaded these weather maps from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada website, and if you look back in 2014, this is just 1 week from June 17th to June 23rd. We're looking at percent of average precipitation. I think everyone remembers that sort of week-long period in 2014 where it just did not stop raining. So really we ended up with more than 200% normal precipitation in just that 1 week. And so when we looked at disease in that year, we had a really high incidence and severity of root rots pretty much all throughout the province in 2014. And then very lucky for me as a plant pathologist, 2015 was the exact opposite. So usually we don't get that opportunity to study diseases in two very opposite years. But what we found, what everyone remembers from last year, was that we had a very dry year. So really below, from about 40 to 85% below normal precipitation from May all the way to July. So what we saw in 2015 was that we had a very low incidence and severity of root rot in that year. And then 2016 is kind of a mixture of both years. It's a bit of an odd year. So again, if we look down here in our little corner of the province, we're drier than normal, but then a lot of other places are about average, and then some areas are even wetter than normal. So what we've been finding this year is that it's been really variable. We're getting pockets of root rot kind of in these wetter areas. So it just goes to show how environment is really the key driver of these diseases. Okay, so what's the impact of root rot on field pea? Well, the number one impact is that we lose that nitrogen fixation ability. And that's why producers love to grow peas in the first place, because they don't require that fertilizer application. So you can see once you have that root rot, you're really losing all the nodules on your peas. As you start to constrict the roots, you don't get any movement of water or nutrients up to the shoots and up to the developing seed. So you get a reduction in overall plant biomass, reduction in plant height, weight. and that leads to reduction in seed yield. And then we also get increased lodging, so the plant gets really weak at this point, so it falls over in heavy winds, which we never have here, right? And then that makes it really hard to harvest as well. So we see that yield losses are becoming more and more common as these root rots are spreading. And here's a picture of, this is actually a lentil field in Southern Alberta, and you can see these sort of yellowing patches here where they're really not going to get a lot of yield off of those. Okay, so just to sort of drive that story home, here's nice, really healthy pea roots, a lot of pink nodules is what we want to see, and then we can contrast that with roots that have a lot of disease, and you can see that there's not much left functioning to those roots. Okay, in terms of disease management, we're still learning a lot about these diseases, so we're still learning about some of the tools that we may have. In terms of resistance, again, we don't have a lot of host resistance in peas. Breeders are working on trying to move what tolerance and resistance we have into good Canadian adapted cultivars, but as Parthiba said, it can take time for breeders to produce new cultivars. So really the tool that we're looking at right now is avoidance, and that's extending crop rotations away from susceptible crops. So kind of going from 4 years up to 6 years, and then we'll see if they maybe even need longer than that. In terms of protection or therapy, we really don't have a lot of fungicides that are available because you can't spray something on the shoots and expect it to go down to the roots. That's not the way plants don't move things downwards. They usually move things upwards. So we don't have movement of fungicides down to the root system. We can use some seed treatments, but those only provide a pretty short-term protection in those first sort of 5 weeks of a plant's life. An exclusion works, but only to try and prevent spread of this pathogen to new fields. So right now when we're seeing that there's a lot of new peas and lentils that are being grown, that's good because these are fields that haven't had peas and lentils before, so they're not really going to be at risk for this disease. And producers need to practice good sort of sanitation so that they're not moving the soil, infested soil from one field to the other. Okay, and so I think one of the big questions is diagnosing root rot. So I've kind of shown how difficult it is to look at the symptoms and know what you're dealing with. So really the recommendation that we provide right now is that they can send samples to a lab. Some of the seed testing labs do an Aphanomyces diagnosis. And so that really helps at least producers know what they're dealing with. In terms of research, we're looking at whether we can also develop a test for testing fusarium in the soil, and also if we can know what inoculum level is in the soil. And really one of the driving questions of my research is, can we develop a risk assessment tool so that a producer can take a soil sample, get it tested, and be told, yes, you're safe to grow peas, or no, you might have to wait a little bit longer to grow peas. Okay, and then some of the other research that we're doing, we're continuing with surveying and diagnostics for root rot pathogens. So these are some of my staff just out the other day looking for pea root rot in some of these fields. We bring all the samples back to the lab, wash them, rate them, and then do a whole series of DNA tests to determine what pathogens are in those roots. And then we're doing some root rot management trials. We have 8 locations scattered throughout the province. So we're looking at if there's any good seed treatments that can be used and if there's any other soil amendment products that can be applied that will help reduce root rots. We're also evaluating cultivars for disease resistance. And then we're trying to look at how these 2 pathogen groups, so Fusarium and Aphanomyces, how they're interacting and whether we can use that interaction to try and improve disease management. So just a summary of the pulse pathology program. Just a reminder that development of disease is dependent on the host, the environment, and the pathogen that all have to meet at the right time. I've shown you some sort of awful pictures of diseases, but just remember that disease is the exception, generally not the rule. But when you do get diseases present in a crop, it can start to threaten sustainable production. White mold of dry bean and root rot of peas are the major focus of my research here in Lethbridge, and really we're looking at trying to develop these integrated disease management strategies so that we can maintain sustainable production. And then so I'd like to thank, I work with a lot of other collaborators, Parthiba, as he mentioned before. Then we work with some other scientists at Ag Canada in Saskatoon and in Brandon. And then we work with some scientists from Alberta Agriculture, University of Alberta, and also University of Saskatchewan. And then we get funding from the Alberta Crop Industry Development Fund, Alberta Pulse Growers, and Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And then lastly, I'd like to thank my research team who does most of this work where I kind of dream up lofty and ridiculous things for them to do and hope they will turn out. So with that, I will take any questions.
I have a question, comment, and it partly probably relates to your study on different types of beans using different varieties. Are they all more or less viney types?
No.
Okay.
There's
Because
Parthiba could probably know more, but
because one of the things that I want to mention, years ago, there was sort of common knowledge, okay, the more viney, the more susceptible
Yeah.
to white mold. But then along came the determinate CDC Pentium from Saskatoon, and white mold came along, and boy, that whole thing just wiped it out. And it was completely determinate upright.
and upright.
No falling over.
Wow.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you have a good range of growth.
Yes,
types.
yeah, we do. Yeah.
The other quick question is, do you do anything, either of you, with bacterial wilt of beans?
Yes. Kazi is also working on that project. So we are trying to develop.
That was identified some years ago here with, what are you doing with that?
Okay, to answer your first question on white mold, yes, the genotypes that we have type 1 Scriptium.
Yeah,
we have because it's determinate and yet it is susceptible. Yeah. Then we have a line from Dr. Phil Mitra's program in USDA in Crossa.
Yes.
It has physiological resistance to white mold, but it's a type 3 growth habit. It has a prostrate growth that is very viney, and yet it is resistant to, so I shouldn't say resistant, moderately resistant to white mold. So we have that, and then in between we have AEC Burnett, which is one of the most upright beans, like residue, with good yield potential, and it has good avoidance to white mold. So we have beans with different growth habits and different levels of susceptibility to white mold, and we are imposing the irrigation treatment on these different bean types with different levels of susceptibility. Mm-hmm. Okay, regarding bacterial wilt. Bacterial wilt was an issue when you were a bean breeder in 2005, 2006. Yes. We were in the bean field together, actually, in AC Polaris field near Bow Island that was heavily infected with bacterial wilt. And so we started working on it. Colorado had issue, Nebraska had issue with bacterial wilt, but then all of a sudden, starting 2009 or so, bacterial wilt pretty much disappeared. You still observe.
Is that when you came?
Yeah. No.
See,
that was a couple years. See, and I think there is a.
2011.
Okay.
I came in 2011, but I think I have a picture of one of these is bacterial wilt here that we did. That we did find in the field. So you do find it, yeah.
You do.
This one here would be bacterial wilt. But
yeah. I'm told that especially in pinto bean and yellow bean field, you find it, and Vitalis still sees bacterial wilt, but it's not to the proportion that they used to see in 2005, 2006. And it's the same thing in Colorado, Nebraska as well, because in the big meeting I meet with the researchers, I asked them the same question, because it's not a major issue anymore. But we had this population developed. So Kazi, during the fall months, in fall and winter, he's working on markers to selection, actually, trying to find molecular markers. So he's phenotyping it, and then he's also genotyping it for molecular markers. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm an armchair farmer.
Yeah.
There's many things marketed to farmers now that are like supplements.
Yeah.
I'm actually a veterinarian, so I see this, and sometimes there seems to be very little support to that. Does those companies approach you? Do they have any sort of supplements that reduce these types of?
I hear a lot of anecdotal evidence from producers that have tried them, but I always say, until we do replicated field trials and have statistical data, it's anecdotal evidence. So, yeah. But I generally haven't done any trials with those kind of products.
Yeah. And how well, like if you which they don't see very much anymore, is a rotation back to forage production? Does that really help these disease cycles?
It can. And there's definitely a renewed interest in use of cover crops, particularly legume cover crops, to try and boost your soil health. The problem with that is that because we're talking about a legume, maybe a legume cover crop or a legume forage crop, they often will maybe be the same hosts for some of these diseases because they're all in the same family. So what we're looking at is maybe using brassica cover crops because those have shown to have really good sort of biofumigation potential in the soil. So to use those as kind of a break to help manage some of these pulse diseases. But then you have issues because there's canola in rotation too, right? So there's always a bit of a juggling and balancing act to try and figure out what are some good rotational crops that can help break these disease cycles.
So with global warming and the changes that are happening in our rainfall patterns, and just as you've shown in the past 3 years, are you expecting more of the diseases from the south to come up to Canada and continue going north? Are you expecting more variability in the weather? Like, do you have any idea, and how are you managing that?
Yeah, I think that's beyond my area of expertise. I think we're always seeing that there are different diseases that are emerging. Some of them kind of fade, and some of them come up in importance. But I can't really make any speculations, I guess, on what we might see as becoming increasing problems.
I heard that the glacier, with the melting,
Yeah.
that water has a lot of toxins that have never been seen. Is that true? And could that affect it coming into the irrigation?
I can't answer that question. I don't know because I don't study anything to do with glaciers or anything like that, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the irrigation and the canopy and all that, so
Yeah.
what role does the agronomy and the row spacing and all this play into how you plan?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. And we do have agronomists that work on some of these. I know there's been a lot of research looking at row spacing of dry beans, so kind of narrow row production versus wide row production. And I think the theory was that with the narrow row production, so as you're reducing that row spacing, that we would see a lot more white mold development. But I think they just did a big study on that a couple years ago and didn't actually see that white mold was was worse than in the wide row irrigation. Wide row spacing. Yeah. So.
Is there a different way to irrigate? Because like everything's overhead, right?
Yeah.
So could you be doing a different,
Yeah.
what are the other options?
Well, there's not a lot of other options here in Southern Alberta. I think everything is kind of based on overhead irrigation, although I have seen a few people installing subsurface drip irrigation systems. I actually think along Highway 3, just a little farther east of the research station, there's kind of a big demo subsurface irrigation plot there. I think it's by, I can't remember who it is that's doing it. But anyway, so there is maybe some options coming in there. I know Ken Coles from Farming Smarter was just putting in a subsurface irrigation on his field to try it out. But down in Idaho, where they do a lot of irrigation, they use furrow irrigation. So it's not overhead irrigation. Parthiba's seen it, so he could probably explain it. But
They do furrow irrigation, but there's also a lot of water is wasted as well. I'm told that overhead irrigation is one of the most efficient way to irrigate. But I know overhead irrigation also promotes bacterial plague as well. So it also helps with the spreading of the disease as well. But in terms of water conservation, overhead irrigation is one of the best compared to furrow irrigation. Because we do bigger seed increases in Idaho, and it's all furrow irrigation. Not last year, but the year prior, I was in the Boise area. There they were using tapes. They call it the irrigation tapes. It's actually dug 4 feet under. But they only use it for those crops, just onions, where they know they could make a huge profit. And then they grow onion, and then they follow onion with a bee, and they leave the tape behind. After that, then they have to remove the tape out. And I asked them, did they have those rows and rows of tape? What do you do with all these plastics that fortunately they recycle? So that's catching up right now. So it's a separate setup that they have, but you really need to have a high value crop in order to pay for the setting up of the tape and all that. I think it's done at least 4 feet deep.
Yeah.
And that's the best way to irrigate. But you also need a high value crop followed by another crop, such as beans or any other crop for that matter.
So basically, no matter what kind of irrigation you're going to do, you're going to just get different types of diseases based off of different.
Actually, with
irrigation.
furrow irrigation, we hardly see any disease.
See a lot less disease, but then you're wasting more
They're wasting a lot
water.
of water because the water hardly touches the plant, and they furrow irrigate every second furrow
Yeah.
as well. And I've seen white mold in Idaho, but there's just one infection point. But in our plants, the picture that I had, or the one that Syama showed, there's so many infection points on the bean plant. Once the white mold comes, it just comes in. But there, the white mold is there, but it doesn't seem to spread. Yeah, so it's because of the moisture, the white mold is there, but it doesn't spread. So.
But they can get rain. I know it's very dry there, but
Yes.
if they get a wet year like they had some wet years too,
Okay.
then they get all the problems.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's possible.
Spent some money and
Yes.
didn't.
Yes.
Either one. And seed coming in from Idaho and otherwise, for years, it always required the streptomycin type treatment, but CFA didn't really want to extend that, and always we got sort of another couple of years extensions. Where is that at now?
Exactly the same place,
Yes.
I think. They're looking again at, right now, they're reevaluating it and trying to decide
That's,
whether.
sorry, that's
That was-
against bacterial blight.
Yeah, yeah. So they're looking at it again and trying to evaluate whether they should allow it for registration again for a limited time or what.
We now have one variety, maybe
Yes,
say a
and
word
we
about
provided-
the
actually-
Black Diamond 2.
We provided feedback, and the breeders in Saskatchewan and Ontario also provided feedback. They mentioned, okay, there's a navy bean line with bacterial bite resistance, maybe there's a yellow bean line with bacterial bite resistance, but we don't have bacterial bite resistance in all of the market classes.
No.
And also, these varieties are not, again, widely grown, so there are a lot of bacterial bite susceptible varieties that are grown. So we just provided feedback last December, actually.
Yeah.
Just before Christmas, we all provided feedback, and Blair Rock, the Parthiba, is the one who's clearing it, so they want an exemption. Yeah, so they're requesting it from Health Canada.
So it hasn't changed in
Yeah.
10 years since
No.
you retired.
20.
20,
Yeah, I know.
yeah,
But yeah.
yeah.
So, no, it's-
We had bacterial bite resistant lines in the red and the Great Northern Market class, but they didn't have the growth habit that we wanted. They didn't have the uptake
No.
or the lodging resistance, so we had to drop them. But we have used those lines as parents, and we have made more crosses. So there are a lot of progenies in the breeding program with resistance, but whether they would become cultivars, we don't know. So I think that's where the issue is.
You talked about the environment as part of that triangle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, what about different types of soils? How do they contribute to
Oh,
root rot?
yeah, absolutely. That's definitely one of the big contributing factors to root rots is the soil types. So we are finding that the dark brown soils, so I didn't show you kind of the maps of root rots, but really where we see that they're the worst is kind of that Drumheller triangle. I don't know what you would call that up in there. But they have the really heavy gumbo clay soils up there, and it's kind of the transition between the dark brown and the black soil zone. And that's definitely where we see that the root rots are the worst, because they're just prone to, they get so compacted because they have that heavy clay. They're prone to having a lot of moisture, and when we don't get the cold winters like we haven't had in a couple of years, that really helps break up some of that compaction, and we haven't been seeing that. So the soils in that area particularly, they're just getting more and more compact. And we see down here in the brown soil zones, areas where we have sandier soils, so up towards Vauxhall, Vulcan, you get a lot better water drainage, you don't get as much compaction. The root rot problems aren't as bad there, so that definitely is a big part of the environment.
What about acidity versus alkalinity?
Um, Yeah, that's a good question. Alkaline soils are a bit better to reduce disease, particularly high calcium soils. The Aphanomyces particularly doesn't like those. So higher alkaline soils are actually better
Like
in this
here.
case. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
What does the farmer do when they get that? I mean, do they lose that whole field
They can.
of beans?
Yeah, we have seen some instances where a farmer has lost a whole field or they've had a very poor yield. But again, that's the exception. It's not what we see all the time. It's a pretty small percentage of that. And then basically we just tell them that, or they know after they've lost yield and haven't made any money off that crop, they just say that they're not going to plant peas in that field again. Yeah.
Now, as a food, I heard peas are more fibrous than beans. Is that true?
I don't know.
Is it because they, snap peas, you eat the whole,
Oh,
shell and all?
yeah.
I just wondered, I read that and
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't really deal with the nutritional aspects at all. I don't think Parthiba does either. I don't know if it would be in the fiber facts pamphlet in the back there. They might have some information there, yeah. I just know that all pulses are good. Right, Elliot? He doesn't like beans very much. He likes chickpea peanut butter cookies.